I just fell in love with just the process, the making part, more so than the finished product. And I think I still feel that way today, especially when I'm engaged in a work. You lose grasp of time and nothing else matters.
Lark Allen III is a graduate of Cranbrook Academy of Art, where he received his M.F.A. in print media in 2014. Allen is non-discriminatory when working with materials and actively engages in various forms of drawing, sculpture, painting, and printmaking. A current Saginaw, Michigan resident, he is an active proponent of health and well-being within communities and attempts to reveal this advocacy through his artwork. Allen's current exhibition, From Africa to Eternity, is now on display at the Saginaw Art Museum through July 1st. Well, Lark, thank you so much for being on the podcast here today and sharing your work with the Saginaw Art Museum through the From Africa to Eternity exhibition. We've had an incredible reception to your work, and it's fascinating. I have the pleasure of getting to see it every day, and every time I find something new. But I'd like to go back a little bit and hear sort of the story of what got you started making art, and some of the origin of what inspires you to continue that art.
Okay, I want to start by saying thank you for having me. In terms of starting making art, when I was really young, I started making art. 6 or 7 is the earliest I can remember. And I'm originally from Elberton, Georgia, which is a small community in North Georgia. And I had the support of the whole community pretty much. And so it started really young. I did murals for my elementary school and all of that. And as I got a little older, I kind of got out of it a little bit because I guess I was trying to do different things, but it never went away. You know, when I was at my downest moments, I would always pick up a pencil or pen and doodle or draw or whatever. So it was always with me.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of that support you had from the community when you were growing up. Did that happen in your own home or throughout the community? Tell me more about that.
Mainly throughout the community. I lived in the kind of household where, in terms of my parents, they were working so much, that they really couldn't spend that quality time. They expected you to have good grades and stuff like that, but in terms of the quality time and nurturing your talents, they really couldn't do it, even though they knew I had talent. So a lot of people in the community, like teachers and just people I knew, they would always support me, and and I would do projects for them, when they requested or whatever. So the support has always been there.
Was there a particular medium that you found most attractive when you first started making art in your youth? And then how did that evolve from there to what you're doing now?
I suppose like most people that start out in art, it was all about drawing. And so for the most part, that's really the only thing I had the resources to do. I really didn't think about doing anything else. I didn't think about painting. I didn't think about sculpture and all the other areas, genres that, that come with being an artist. So that kind of changed for me. Really didn't change for me until I went to college. That's when it changed for me somewhat. And I was like, there's more to this. And I took a sculpture class. They was offering sculpture at my community college for the first time. I took a sculpture class, and for some reason, it was one of those things that I just felt I could do, And so I think the rest is history. Yeah. So I think really that's where it started, just me being introduced and coming in contact, just with the right person at the right time. And that's kind of been like the roadmap of my life.
Yeah. It's interesting how, there's points along the way. That's what I'm hearing you say, is different people along the way have inspired you and sort of pushed you onto that next level in your creative endeavors. When you started, in this sculpture class, did you have a concept that it would evolve into the kind of work that you're doing now with these masks that you're creating?
No. It's totally different, but very similar because it's all about the process. When I took the sculpture class, I just fell in love with just the process, the making part, more so than the finished product. And I think I still feel that way today, especially when I'm engaged in a work. You lose grasp of time, and nothing else matters.
So let's talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with these masks now, and the process that you go through to create these masks that are essentially from found and discarded objects. When did that concept or idea come to you? And can you describe a little bit more about the process of making the masks?
I never ever thought about working that way. Never crossed my mind until I got to college. Actually, I left the junior college. I graduated and I transferred to Clark Atlanta University. Anybody that's familiar with Clark Atlanta University, they're under an umbrella, a consortium of other colleges like Morehouse, Spelman, I think it's a Theological Institute, ITC, and used to be Morris Brown. So many of the students cross-register for courses. For example, at my particular institution, we didn't have sculpture there. You had to take sculpture at Spelman. So by the luck of the draw, I met my sculpture teacher, Toby Martin, the late Toby Martin, and who actually, that's who I'm influenced by in terms of working in a diachronic way. He made diachronic sculptures, and really like the challenging part about his class, because he just had one class. You had to make 8 different sculptures out of 8 different materials. That was the class. And so he actually adopted that model from his predecessor, George Beasley, who was a Cranbrook alum that founded the sculpture department at Georgia State University. So it's kind of strange how things fall into place, but that's kind of what's my path. And to revert back to that very first sculpture class I took at the other college, my instructor was Don Dugan. He was also taught by George Beasley. And he and Toby Martin were classmates in graduate school. So nobody knew this. Nobody knew that I knew them. They didn't know that I knew them, or, it was just a strange thing. Yeah, so being in his course and having to be challenged to work with different mediums and different materials, and he would walk you through every process, and from that point on, you was on your own. So in that one class, I learned woodworking, mold making, welding, found objects, making found object stuff, we had to do sculptures from nature. So taking this course really opened my eyes on the possibilities of creating.
Yeah. Well, it's almost as though that need to work, like to create eight different masks from different objects, it gave you a little bit of a lane, but there's also a lot of creativity that's within that lane to figure out new things. And here you are sort of putting all those pieces together.
Well, yeah, it's kind of, when I make things, usually I don't know where I'm going. It's kind of like almost like a dance. So you're trying to you're trying to figure out what direction to go, but the more I'm engaged in the process, the more things just seem to fall in place. And I use my intuition a lot in terms of knowing what's enough and what's not, you know.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea of, especially with the kind of work that you're doing, is when to make the decision about, is this done or is this not done? Tell me a little bit more about how that thought process works, or you know, you mentioned intuition, but you also have this deep training of how the materials work, and I'd love for you to comment on sort of how that end process works. Is it done? Is it not done?
Okay, very good question. The end process, you kind of know when it's done. At least I do in my eyes. I've never made, or at least in my opinion, overly saturated work, even though I'm trying to get to that point. Without taking away from what's underneath. But you never really know. When I work, I'm no different than anybody else. You know, I get stumped on projects. I'm usually working on about 5 things at one time. That's just the way my brain operates. And so when I'm lost as far as ideas, I just move to the next project, so I keep working.
Yeah. I've had other guests on the podcast that talk about this element of just making things, like continuing to make things and not get too hung up on a problem, because otherwise you just end up spinning your wheels. And is that a fair description of what happens in your process?
Exactly. And it's no different than a writer. You know, you hear a writer's block or whatnot. You know, writers have to get up and they have to do something else. And so it's basically the same situation. With me, when I leave a project, I'm always thinking about that project, even if I'm doing something else. I'm trying to figure out how I can solve a particular creative problem or whatnot. You know, if there's an unfinished project that I have, I'm always thinking about it, whether I'm working on something else or at the grocery store. So that's pretty much my process.
Yeah, almost like you have a parallel brain, like the one part of you is doing one thing and the other part's thinking about whatever you're trying to solve. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's definitely not good when your wife is asking you questions about stuff.
Yeah. I can imagine there can be a little bit of yes, dear, but not always hearing, right? Yeah. That's funny. So with the current exhibition, From Africa to Eternity, tell me a little bit more about the title that's been selected for this exhibition, and a little bit of that background.
Well, my brother and I came up with the title, and I didn't do much research on the title. Comes to find out, someone else has used that title and actively, collects objects similar to Kevin Jones. But the title "Africa to Eternity," I wanted to convey some type of message of there being a bridge, like bridging a gap, so to speak. And the series is totally about Black diasporans, and I felt it was important because there are issues that's going on with Black diasporans that are not going on with anybody else. So I felt it was important to show that link, but also show a connection to Africa. So that's been my intent when making these masks. Would you like to know about more about the process?
Yeah, absolutely.
So stylistically, my intent is to is for the mask to resemble ancient African masks, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, it's very important for me to reveal my existence as an African American. So that's where things like the technology, references to technology, and consumerism and things like that come into play. So my hope is to create a balance. I don't know if I always do that, but that's pretty much where I'm centered as far as beginning the process.
It is interesting looking at the variety of objects that you've used in your mask, and some of that focus on the technology and objects that have been discarded but were once seen as valuable to somebody. I mean, a digital camera isn't a small thing, but that popularization of cameras has changed that because of the consumerism. But at the same time, you have some more very traditional kinds of materials as well, with the wood, and I'm thinking of some of the wrappers, or yeah.
So I feel it's important for me, at least in terms of a base or a foundation, for those traditional materials to still be present underneath the layers of wherever I go with a particular piece.
If you had some advice for aspiring artists or young artists, what would you tell them?
Oh, that's a great question. Do what you like to do. Most people know what they like to do, but they don't think that's the path. That's the most important thing I can say about that. And also be willing to learn new things. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I was kind of fortunate in the people that I met, because honestly, my career probably would have took a totally different path because I can do so many things artistically, But, I was unhappy doing those things. I can make paintings and in various styles or do traditional type stuff, but I wasn't getting a lot of gratification out of it. And so I would just say, just follow your heart. Don't be afraid to do things that seem a little weird or outside of the box, because that's a part of you, and everybody has something unique to offer in terms of making art. I think that's the most valuable thing about being an artist. It's kind of like your writing style. Nobody can copy your writing style, so why would you try to write like somebody else? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the only advice I could give them.
Yeah. Perfect.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Temple Arts Podcast. Please consider subscribing to the podcast and making a donation to the arts through SaginawArtMuseum.org or TempleTheater.com. This will allow us to continue to bring enriching programming to Saginaw and beyond.